right, everyone, welcome back. There's a bit of a lag, I notice, at the beginning of every recording. Hopefully science and technology will remedy that at some point. Okay, so that is the topic for this week, and maybe a little bit into next week, as we also start talking about, I believe, war and terrorism. I'll also later on this week start talking about the project, the final project. Because I know, some of you are probably interested in that. I'll also talk about the first exam, probably on the lecture on Friday. You're also probably wondering what's behind these doors. I don't know. We'll find out at some point this semester. Okay. So, I hope you all enjoyed your Wellness Day. I hope you're able to, maybe get off of the screen for a little bit, or maybe stay on it to get some work done. I decided to record my lecture during this Wellness Day. So, we are living in a time where science and technology are posing huge, tremendous risks, as well as solving huge and tremendous problems. I love this quote by Carl Sagan. I won't read it. You can read it on your own. If you want to see sort of a master class on government corruption, bureaucratic mismanagement, Chernobyl, the show miniseries on HBO, Chernobyl, it's about 6 hours, I believe, does a fantastic job of showing what happened in the nuclear meltdown in Chernobyl in the former Soviet Union, and what the government did, and how close Eurasia and the world really came to major disaster there. One of the classic books on risk got by a guy named Charles Perrow. I don't want to say my friend Pello, but it's Charles Perrow. It's called Normal Accidents, Living with High-Risk Technology. So those of you who are interested in sort of risk and risk analysis, I would highly recommend this book. And, it spawned a whole series of literature, other studies, with more updated risks. So we live in a time of tremendous change. And I do want to make a plug for this book that I'm kind of reading. It's by a political scientist, sociologist named Timothy Luke. Some of his writings that he's written for the last 40 years or something, that are very good. I mean, he's just really on point, I think, and I'm just, this stuff from the 60s, as he's saying the right things then, and I think that he's saying the right things now. He has this book, Anthropocene Alerts, Critical Theory of the Contemporary as Eco-Critique, by the Telos publisher, which is a kind of a controversial publisher. But he looks at the beginning of the environmental movement, the Unabomber, which we'll talk about on Friday next week a little bit. He also talks about accelerationism and the Dark Enlightenment, which we'll also discuss later. Accelerationism, basically this belief, there's different ways to think about it, but the broadest one, probably the most widely used way in which it's applied is to think about capitalism and accelerating capitalism, essentially, to the point where the system breaks. It's all about sort of systems breaking down. So he kind of looks at that and kind of studies that, some of these theorists, somewhat critically. As I say, I highly recommend this if you're interested in environmental stuff, but not just the environment, but also science and technology, because they're sort of, it's hard to separate the two, actually. And technology, are we talking about good things or bad things? Is it good? Technology has good and bad consequences, as we know, as we saw in that documentary on the internet. It facilitates this sort of learning. Even though there's a huge deadly pandemic, we're still able to hold classes because of technology, and instruct younger people on how to, save us all, I guess. Nevertheless, it's also led to misinformation, and people get there's all sorts of internet addictions and so on and so forth. So there's, again, pros and cons. It's technology brings good things and bad things. Also, this is where I want to kind of bring in the theorist Mark Fisher. Mark Fisher was an interesting British cultural theorist. He died by suicide in 2017. Excuse me. Which was not surprising. I mean, he wrote about depression quite a bit. He has this book, Ghosts of My Life, Writings on Depression, Hauntology, and Lost Futures, which I have right here too. And he also has this book called K-Punk, which is a collection of these blog posts that he made, because he started out just kind of blogging under this blog post named K-Punk. That's about 1,000 pages, though, so I don't have that one. Maybe one of these days. But what I really like is he kind of moves away from the standard postmodern analysis. So modernity, the modern era, is the era that we live in now, industrial relations, a powerful nation state. Postmodernism is this world of kind of, the last 40 years of media, where electronic media has played a huge role in shaping our cultural beliefs and attitudes and so on. And so postmodernism was this kind of range of different theories and ideas that came out of France in the 1970s. And, there's pros and cons to it. We won't get into it too much. But anyway, he kind of would fall into the more modern, postmodern sort of area here. What I do like is this concept he uses called hauntology. So it really it comes from a postmodern theorist named Jacques Derrida, initially using hauntology to refer to the ghost of Marxism, meaning that is still haunting Europe, European universities and social thought and so on. And then this idea has now been taken to hauntology to describe social change more broadly. That's, as I say here, we are haunted by the potential futures that have never occurred, and we're surrounded by the remnants of the past. So Mark Fisher was about 10 years older than I am, born, I believe, in the late 60s, early 70s. And, he talks about how nostalgia has become this, powerful cultural force, and that it makes him, just very depressed because it feels like, culture is over, he calls it the slow cancellation of the future. And what I think people can take with this theory and sort of run with it, to apply it to, COVID-19, all the futures that we sort of envision for our own personal lives, the world, so many things that we're haunted by. I mean, continually. I think this idea applies now more than ever, more than when he wrote it. I mean, I'm haunted by concerts I want to go to, haunted by trips that I had planned, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, classes that I hope to be in, and so forth. So again, it's something that it's a short book. It's very British, so there's a lot of British cultural references. So they're older, from like the 70s and 80s. So just be aware of that if you're so interested. Okay, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Your book talks about this in more detail. So mechanization, just basically moving from hand tools to more, machines, essentially. Automation, basically as we're turning, as we're turning, people working at cash registers to automatic machines, automatic checkout machines. I don't know even what they're called. I used to work in a grocery store at one point. Cybernation. Now, this is the new thing that we'll talk about a bit more also next time. Some of these sort of techno-utopian ideas that we see. The structural functionalist perspective, again, is trying to look at how a society functions from sort of a moral perspective. One of the things that they worry about, or if you're a functionalist, you're concerned about perhaps how fast things are moving, how fast technology is moving in science and so forth, and how it's being applied, and if we're making the right decisions with it, and so on. Cultural lag. This is something that essentially this is part of our culture, things that we do, even though the technology has moved beyond it. I still say watch stuff on TV, even though I'm watching it on like a laptop or a phone. A whole range of references to technologies that aren't around anymore. So cultural lag, that's something I think is a fascinating topic, again, for more people to explore. Conflict perspective, remember, focusing on sort of who are the winners and losers in science and technology. Conflict theorists then look at, okay, who is funding the research? Is it, generally they have been in the West looking at corporations. Is there some monopoly that's abusing the system essentially? And they also point out that a lot of the technology that's coming out is not really to better our lives; it's to better someone's bank account. That's the argument that they make. And feminists also can argue that technology can extend certain patriarchal notions and so on. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about gender specifically. When we talk about the symbolic interactionist perspective, I think this is perhaps one of the most important, at least when it comes to understanding both the conflict perspective and the functionalist perspective. Understanding just how science discovery and the application of scientific methods, how that occurs. Some of you may be familiar with Thomas Kuhn. This is sort of the revolutionary work called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he pointed out this basic cycle that science goes through, where you have normal science, the models drift, maybe they're not really working out, pretty soon the models aren't working. When the banks crashed back in 2008, the chairman of the Federal Reserve was a strong, libertarian leaning banker, and he brought Ayn Rand to his when he was hired by the president. Ayn Rand was a famous libertarian philosopher. Anyway, when the banks crashed and he was on the testifying in front of Congress, he said that the model that we thought explained the world, it was wrong. That was really a stunning admission. By someone who had spent their lives really arguing against that. So anyway, there you get a model revolution, and then you get a paradigm change, and pretty soon you have a new understanding of the world, and so on. So we have, science fiction in some ways is a great guide. I was a fan of science fiction, a little bit when I was a kid, not huge. And actually, I think it was in the last 10 years, when I was living out in California, and just, the technological revolution that was sort of happening all around me out there, kind of got me more interested in science fiction again. So I've been kind of returning to it, but kind of looking at it through the lens of a sociologist, and, seeing how people have imagined the future to be. It's kind of fascinating. And then again, which brings us to, Mark Fisher, these futures that, here we are in 2021, and we've surpassed all these movies that have us, in flying cars and all those things. Anyway, our society is certainly, we've been looking forward to, artificial intelligence and robots for quite some time. Okay, so one important term is this idea called future shock. Basically, this is what a lot of us are going through right now around the planet. When the technological change is so rapid and so dramatic that it just shakes us and just completely disorients us. This is future shock, and that is definitely what's happening right now. I mean, it's really amazing that we're in 2021. This, the smartphone here has only been in existence since 2007, commercially available since about 2008. I mean, it's changed the world in amazing ways that we're still shocked by it. So a couple of years ago, a book came out called Race Against the Machine, and it was looking at how automation would replace human labor. That you would see pretty soon robots doing more and more jobs. And what are people going to do? This has been a question since at least Karl Marx was writing about it. Throughout the Industrial Revolution, people have thought about it. The difference now is that the technology is so much more advanced, and artificial intelligence is much different than some of these other technologies of the past. The other concern, it's hard to say about automation. We'll maybe talk about that. We will talk about that later. But one thing that we definitely do see is the rise in inequalities as a result of technology, of science and technology. So in my other class, SOC 1, Introduction to Sociology, we're reading this book, The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, A Warning to the Global Middle Class. I would highly recommend this. It's pointing out that, there's this class of people, this sort of expert class that's, at the top of this, new pyramid, essentially, this new feudalism. Back in the Middle Ages, it was kings, then you got the lords and vassals and so on, and then you got the serfs, the peasants, essentially. Today, you've got, however you want to say, investors, entrepreneurs, users. I don't know if that's a perfect, breakdown of the digital feudalism, but probably pretty close. The feudalism was a system that was very hierarchical, and it was not democratic. And people who succeeded in that system were born into it. You became a duke because your father had a position. You were a duchess or a queen or whatever because of your family. So today we live in a capitalist system where the idea is that you're able to work hard, and if you're an entrepreneur, then you can work hard and get to where you want to be, and just takes grit and so on and so forth. Well, I wrote a book about entrepreneurialism, and I've done a lot of research on that. And the fact of the matter is that there are two groups in our society where you see entrepreneurs coming from. First are recent immigrants, which makes sense. Immigrating by itself is a very entrepreneurial, risky act. And oftentimes their immigrants, may have trouble getting into the labor force because of language barriers or whatever it might be. So they will start a business usually that caters to other immigrants initially, and then maybe broader. So immigrants, big source of entrepreneurialism. The other group is people who come from wealthy families, who oftentimes have a financial cushion if their business fails. And most, successful entrepreneurs have a few failures before, making it big. So when you look at that and you start to see that, a lot of the wealth and the access to opportunity is pretty entrenched at some higher and higher levels, you start to see it starts to look more like feudalism than anything we've seen in the last 100 or 200 years. And you, in fact, see, people making the argument for bringing back feudalism, not just in the United States, but around the world. And then there's also some who say that, well, instead of feudalism, how about communism, but not the 20th century kind? We'll have a new kind that will be, we'll just sit back and let the robots do everything for us. I mean, it's kind of like a totally utopian dream. The manifesto of this is fully automated luxury communism. I admit I have not read this. It's on my to-read list. But anyway, the idea is that, okay, we've got this amazing technology. We have these huge wealth inequalities, and history shows that, you can't have that for too long before you get some sort of breakdown or revolution, civil wars, that sort of thing. So this is, potentially a different route to take. So anyway, just some things to consider. Because our world now, whatever your ideology, whether you're a neo-monarchist or you're a neo-communist, libertarian, socialist, whatever. Increasingly, information communication technology is extremely important, as you well know, and as investors in Zoom found out or knew early on. I should have put money in there when I had the chance. People always say after the chance is gone. Okay, so I'm not going to go over this too much. Some of this was in the video you watched. The Turing machine, Alan Turing, kind of built one of the first computers. It was a hypothetical kind of machine. The great movie about it called The Imitation Game. It helped crack the code that the Nazis were using and helped, essentially win the Second World War for the Allied forces. And what's fascinating is that this was all classified until I believe the mid-1990s, which is way later than the Second World War ended, 1945. That means that there's been many, many books and movies that have been made on World War II that have explained it without this information, which essentially is a huge missing piece out of history. Kind of a sobering way to think about it. So, you have the transistor. This is one of the most important inventions of the 20th century. Some people argue of all time. I would say the flushing toilet is actually probably one of the biggest, most important and revolutionary inventions of all time. And I will argue that strenuously. Okay. So, as I said, I'm not going to go too much into the technical aspects of the transistor, but you start to understand why semiconductor materials are so important and why powerful countries like the United States and China and Russia are sort of racing around the world trying to corner these markets on some of these materials, and may lead to some frightening competitions in the future. Here's one of the first, it was a replica of the first transistor at Bell Labs back in 1947. Here's you had the transistor radio, this was kind of a big thing. You could carry it around in your pocket and listen to the radio, could, eat cereal and listen to it. It was an amazing invention at the time. And it helped, power the first transistor computer, which, a little bit bigger than the ones we put into our pocket today. I think that's pretty amazing. The average phone today has more computing power than NASA did when they sent people to the moon back in the 60s. Pretty fascinating. So the first integrated circuit was developed by Robert Noyce of Fairchild, and later went on to develop the silicon chip. And once they started making it out of silicon, then the revolution happened. Then you started to get Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley gets its name from that. So the microchip, the first integrated circuit, is basically a bunch of transistors on a tiny chip, and they keep on making them smaller and smaller and smaller, and this was the advent of the computer revolution, and led to Moore's law. this guy, Gordon Moore, still alive, I believe. Moore's law is basically this observation he made that over the history of computation, every 2 years they're able to double the number of transistors on their microchip. So it's growing exponentially, like COVID in population and things like that. So here is just kind of the growth of various computing devices. Ray Kurzweil, talk about him next time. The singularity, this basically idea of humans becoming robots and whatever. We'll get there. So basically looking at where we're getting to come close to a mouse brain. Maybe at some point we'll reach the human brain. Although some people are saying now that Moore's law is slowing down. And then I had a student say that no, it's actually speeding up. So I'm not actually quite sure where it stands right now. Some of you probably know more than me. But this, revolutionized things. I mean, this is the old, household computer. The household computer, excuse me. We watched that video on de-extinction. Stuart Brand, he was very involved with the development of the household, of the personal computer. I mean, they were trying back in the 60s to, create computers that you could use at home. That's what, he was involved in that effort. So was LSD. They did a lot of acid and worked on computers. Very interesting history. That's Silicon Valley. Okay, so this is the internet back in 1973. The ARPA network was basically when it was coming out of the defense agency that put it together. This is looking at it in 1977. That's the internet. Kind of amazing. Just a few years before I was born there. If you want to look at a geographic picture, mostly in the United States, it goes out to London, goes out to Hawaii, but that was the internet. And, obviously today it is, at the center of our communication and how the world moves. When I was in college, I guess back when I was in high school, the way in which you would chat was this thing called AOL Instant Messenger, AOL America Online. And then you would have this buddy list and you could talk to people and there were chat rooms and so on. So kind of, early social media type thing. Now, the big change too is that, personal computers, they're already declining, and smartphones, tablets, things like that, those are what's flying off of the shelves today. Now, one thing, something to really keep in mind is that back in the early 1990s and even into the early 2000s, I think there was a lot more cyber utopianism. John Perry Barlow, was this really, powerful voice for, free speech and, being free of government control, of, corporate control, that sort of thing. This idea that you could have the internet, this way in which everyone could be connected and you could free yourselves of these external controls. I think, and other people, were optimistic too. I was very optimistic, when I was in college and high school that, about the good things of the internet. For the most part, it seemed to be, connecting people in good ways. And I think that's still the case. I'll see what your comments say. Those might sway me one way or the other. But, the internet has changed. It's become sort of, the term is Balkanized sometimes, like in the Balkan countries in Europe where they were kind of split up and stuff. So we're probably seeing, different internet authorities evolve in China, the United States, Russia, and so on and so forth. And we're seeing, just a whole explosion of things that people probably did not expect back in the 1990s and so on. Politics became extremely popular over the course of the last 10 years. Is it because politics by itself has gotten more interesting? Is the Constitution really more interesting now than it was in the 1990s or something like this? No. Is constitutional law, that sort of thing? No. The reality, though, is that the internet, and especially the smartphone, has allowed us to think about these things and communicate about them, which overall is a good thing. I think the problem, though, is how do we fend off misinformation? That, as we know, that's a challenge which we are going to talk about. One of the big things, some of you may know more about this than me, is this development of the semantic web, sometimes thought of as Web 3.0, but developing a much deeper understanding of the way human thought works, and designing the internet according to that. I know it seems like that we already do that. Don't algorithms do that already? To some extent, but not completely. It's still quite a long ways from the human mind, essentially. But again, we also have, as I said, these huge companies and platforms and so on that really dictate a lot of what we think, what we see, and therefore what we think, what we're exposed to, what we buy, all of these things. Political discord, all various things. Some people may not be familiar with Alibaba, but should be. Alibaba is the largest retailer in the world. It's larger than Amazon, largest online retailer in China. Huge company, and kind of like Amazon, it's sprung out into all different areas. It's not just selling goods anymore. Weibo is a Chinese social media platform. You're familiar with Snapchat, Instagram, and so on. Facebook's still around. I remember the old ones back before we called it social media, like MySpace, where I met my wife, actually. And my first line to her was, "So I see you like cats." And I reeled that fish out of the sea. And so Friendster was another one. So anyway, yeah. So technology, as I said, is not all bad. I met my wife online, so that's not a very strange thing anymore. It was still kind of a new thing back when we met. Now it's just kind of seems to be the norm. Now the challenge, though, as I said, as we've talked about, the power that especially governments hold. In 1948, George Orwell, whose real name, by the way, is Eric Blair. And I like that because my name's Eric and I grew up in a town called Blair. But anyway, George Orwell, that's his pen name, wrote this book called 1984. He wrote it in 1948. And it was kind of based on sort of, what he had seen in the last, 10, 20 years, fascism, Soviet communism, totalitarianism, those sorts of systems where the government is always sort of watching you. And he wrote about it, and he called, named this all watching, government Big Brother. So if you, hear the phrase Big Brother, that's where that comes from. Famous book on, totalitarianism is The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt. We'll talk about that. It's not perhaps the most accurate. Well, no. If you're interested in that area, you should read it. I would say that she kind of lumps in Soviet communism and Nazism a little bit too closely, and I think they're a bit more distinct. And anyway, we'll get there. Okay. So about this time, you also have an anthropologist, economist named Karl Polanyi. He writes this book called The Great Transformation. And his whole thesis here is to argue that essentially you have this transformation that occurs in the 1800s and early 1900s, where you get the self-regulating economy, or at least the idea of the self-regulating economy, where, social activity, where, that is for markets is now called labor. Nature is, land or real estate. Exchange is money. And so he talks about how this is really kind of at the heart of, undergirds everything, even our technologies and oftentimes our governments. And so Shoshana Zuboff, a professor at Harvard Business School, I believe. She says, okay, there's those three are good. The labor, real estate, land, nature, exchange, money. She says there's another one now because society has changed, and that behavior is now reborn as data or analytics. And some of you are, maybe you're soda majors, social data and analysis, whatever that new program is that's doing cool stuff. Anyway, basically, and she's looking at how people, this new age of capitalism is based upon data and, data mining, extraction, and using it to power companies and so on. So I highly recommend it. It's a fantastic book. I've got it right here, and you see I've been reading it. Noted some important pages here and there. I don't know why I'm showing you all these books, just in case I guess you're skeptical that they just exist on a PowerPoint. Like, no, here, see, they're real. It's not fake news. Okay. All right. So Shoshana Zuboff. Now, this book is fantastic. I mean, if you're interested in the world that we live in, especially now, I mean, in quarantine where, we're all on the internet even more, we're all, being surveilled even more. And if you're bored and you need something to read, look, it's a fairly thick book, but it gives you a good history of Google and China and, how everyone has been using the internet to mine data, essentially. So she points out that totalitarianism was a transformation of the state into a project of total possession. And she uses this term instrumentarianism. And she says big other. Instead of big brother, she says big other, because a lot of these algorithms and these, machines that are doing the analysis, they're not human. These are just artificial intelligence that are just, cranking out algorithms and running programs. It's not personal. It's not, it's not like Big Brother was, essentially. So they're saying, and she says, instrumentarianism and big other signal the transformation of the market into a project of total certainty. I think that's really fascinating. So I want to play this clip. Well, let me go here first. Some of you may be familiar with B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner was one of the early founders of behavioral psychology, which basically looked at reward and punishment and how that, essentially dictates most behavior. Whether it does or not, that's a huge debate in psychology. But instrumentarianism and what she calls surveillance capitalism really relies upon behavioral techniques. That you shall see. I'm going to show part of this documentary that's really, really interesting. This is Shoshana Zuboff herself. Just watch a few minutes of this. How many of you have played Pokemon Go? If you've played Pokemon Go, you might find this pretty interesting.
Business customers who want to maximize our value to their business, whatever it may be. They use information from our faces, which we've given billions and billions of photos to Facebook to train models for facial recognition. Those models are then sold to military operations, some of them in China. And those Chinese operations do many things, including imprisoning the Uyghur, a subset of the Uyghur Muslim population in China, in what is rightly regarded as an open-air prison, where they actually don't have to have people behind bars because they track and follow them constantly through facial recognition.
The knowledge obtained from our residual data can be sold to anyone. Facial recognition software, for instance, might be sold to a Chinese company that supports the oppression of the Uyghurs in China, or that helps track down advocates of democracy in Hong Kong. That way, our precious family photos might be used by Facebook to facilitate authoritarian regimes. And our privacy is guaranteed. Because it's not our faces that are sold, it's the residual data scraped off them.
It's very difficult to have a concept of this for a very good reason. It's not because we're stupid. It's because these processes have been disguised. They operate in stealth. They have been engineered to be indecipherable, to be undetectable, to create ignorance in a vast group of all of us that they call users. Our ignorance is their bliss. There are some things that have broken through into the public view that we do know about. So let's talk about Facebook's massive scale contagion experiments. And this is where Facebook experimented with subliminal cues planted in its Facebook pages that would actually influence offline, real-world behavior and emotions to see if they could make people feel happier or sadder using subliminal cues with language manipulation and word manipulation and so on. Well, when the experimenters wrote up this work in the very prestigious scholarly journals that published the results of these experiments, they emphasized two key findings. Number one, we now know that we can manipulate subliminal cues in the online context to change real-world behavior or real-world emotion. We know that we can be successful at doing this. Number two, we can exercise this power, these methods, while bypassing user awareness.
Een grote groep Pokémon Go-spelers heeft met elkaar afgesproken in Leeuwarden. Samen gaan ze de stad door om zoveel mogelijk Pokémon te vangen. Alleen in Nederland al spelen ruim 1,3 miljoen mensen het spel.
A very interesting experiment occurs in the guise of an augmented reality game called Pokémon Go.
In het spel loop je rond in de echte wereld. Op allerlei plekken zitten Pokémon verstopt. Je moet er dus naartoe gaan om ze te verzamelen.
What are we not seeing when Pokemon Go is introduced in our country?
It's important to understand that Pokemon Go is an augmented reality game that was incubated, developed inside Google for many years. Google being the first pioneer of surveillance capitalism, the inventor of surveillance capitalism. It was invented, Pokemon Go was invented in Google, incubated there for many years, developed there, led by a man named John Hanke. And John Hanke invented an operation called Keyhole, which was invested in by the CIA and later...
Wonder.
This is our home.
Howdy, neighbors! Hey!
They're purchased by Google and called Google Earth.
Google Earth was a CIA startup initially.
Yes, Google Earth was something called Keyhole, and it was a CIA-invested startup. So it's important to understand that Pokemon Go was not some happy little game that just got launched into the world by a toy company or something. When they decided to bring Pokemon Go to the public, they didn't want to bring it as a Google game. They brought it to market as Niantic Labs, which no one had ever heard of. Just a cool startup with this cool game. So now we have this Google augmented reality game, and it turns out that the big game that is on top of the little game that the children are playing is a game that precisely emulates the logic of surveillance capitalism. So in surveillance capitalism, in the original version online, we predict the click-through rate, and we sell the click-through rate to the advertiser, who pays to get clicks on their website, clicking through ultimately to the buy button. That's what they're hoping for. Now, in the real world, business customers paid Niantic Labs, the Pokemon Go company, paid Niantic Labs not for click-through, but for the real-world equivalent of click-through, which is called footfall. To actually get real bodies with their real feet into real business establishments so that their feet would go fall, tap, tap, tap across the store or across the restaurant or across the bar in order to buy something.
So I could order by Niantic Labs a Pokemon in my ice cream parlor, for instance.
All of these establishments, they're buying what are called, here's the term, lure modules. Modules like a gym that lure people to you. Not so that they will come and be happy, but so they will come and spend money in your shop or your restaurant. Starbucks, McDonald's, everybody was making money. Everybody was making money. Niantic Labs was making money, and all these businesses were making money. And the people playing the game had no idea. So they used the rewards and punishment of the game to herd you through the city to the places that were paying for your body. This was the game of Pokemon Go. This was the real game, the shadow game, getting you into a place where we have predicted that you will be, so that our predictions are worth more. If I can guarantee you're actually going to be there, my prediction that you're going to be there is worth a lot more. Economies of action are how I guarantee that. And Pokemon Go was a large-scale experiment, a global-scale experiment in economies of action, using remote control means to automate behavior, to engineer behavior, to fulfill others' commercial ends, while you are having a great time.
All right. As I said, that's a fascinating documentary. I'll post the documentary in the modules if you feel like watching something. And you see there, I mean, Pokemon Go, I'm sure a number of you played that and probably didn't know that that was what was really going on. Who knows what kind of various surveillance techniques have arisen since the pandemic happened and since we've become more and more dependent upon computers. Some of us had New Year's resolutions in 2020. I'm not going to spend as much time online. That didn't work out too well. Okay, so as I said, and as she pointed out, I mean, it's behavioral psychology being put to use for, reasons which are, kind of questionable. So take a look at this. You're all probably familiar with the standard layout of a smartphone with the various apps and so on. You may not know exactly where this design came from or what influenced it, but take a look at this here in Las Vegas. You've got a casino. You've got the slot machines here. And there you've got the smartphone pages. Slot machines. Yes, there was actually the people who designed the apps. They looked to the slot machines for guidance because the designers of the slot machines also had studied psychology. So if you ever go into a casino, you'll notice there aren't clocks anywhere. That there's usually a pattern, simple patterns on the floors, but all these flashing lights, things to draw you in, and our brains are just like, oh wow, flashing lights. and so it's quite effective. So it is pretty, it's pretty amazing, what all is now being put into computers. And, we have some, laptop there, but increasingly, we're putting all of this onto phones. So it's really quite incredible. So we will stop there, and I'll go more into the age of surveillance capitalism on Friday, and also talk about a range of other technologies and things like that. All right, so everyone have a good day on this Wednesday.